Line will not be seen tonight, so we may bring you this special broadcast from ABC News.
Good evening, I'm Peter Jennings in Washington. Once again, we welcome you to a most unusual event, the second in our series of debates between the Congress and the Supreme Soviet. And for the first time tonight, a discussion seen live and unedited in the Soviet Union on the subject of human rights. Americans believe that committing Soviet prisoners to psychiatric hospitals because of their political beliefs is an outright abuse of human rights. The Soviets believe that more than 2 million homeless Americans have been deprived of a basic human right. Americans believe that thousands of Soviets who have applied to leave their country and have been told no have had an essential human right withheld from them. And Soviets ask, what rights do 7 million Americans have who are the chronic unemployed? The abuse of basic human rights, as each side sees it in the other, is the issue to be debated tonight, from capital to capital.
Live from the Kremlin in Moscow, before an audience of the Supreme Soviet, and live from the Capitol in Washington, before an audience of the Congress. This is ABC News, Capital to Capital. Here now, Peter Jennings.
The Washington end of this broadcast comes from the committee room normally used by the House Committee on Public Works and Transportation, and we thank them for the use of the hall. Joining me here to represent the Congress are two members widely respected for their knowledge of what we're going to talk about tonight. The senior senator from New York, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Senator Moynihan has long been an outspoken advocate of human rights, both in the Soviet Union and also here at home. And Congressman Steny Hoyer from Maryland. The congressman is the principal U.S. representative on the committee which monitors the Helsinki Accords. We are bound to hear a lot about the human rights provisions of those accords tonight. Now, just before I introduce the Soviet panel, a word on what we hope to accomplish. The Soviet Union and the U.S. have talked countless times on this subject, but almost invariably in a formal, ritualistic way. Tonight, in what we believe will be a more spontaneous exchange, we'll try to find out if the present reform in the Soviet Union is permanent or only a passing phase. And we will surely hear what the Soviets think of our record on human rights. And now to Moscow. The panelists there are in a committee room of the Central Committee. They are Vadim Zagladin, he's the first deputy chief of the International Department of the Soviet Central Committee, and Ivan Laptev, who is a candidate member of the Central Committee, but very importantly, the editor-in-chief of the government newspaper Izvestia. He's 51, he's regarded as something of a rising star under Mr. Gorbachev. And once again, the Soviet moderator is Leonid Zolotarevsky. Leonid used to work in Afghanistan for Soviet television, and he now works in the department which coordinates these international exchanges. Leonid, good evening. It is nice to see you again. In our country, we had quite a lot of reaction after the last broadcast. How about in the Soviet Union?
Good morning, Peter. I'm very pleased to see you. We had an amazing reaction. Much was written about it in the press, newspapers, periodicals, there were photographs, there were many responses from viewers, so there was a great deal of interest, a great deal of response. I think as we discuss ever new problems, the interest will grow.
Well, Leonid, as you know, the audience in this country thinks tonight is an extremely important occasion, and we will come back and start it with you in earnest in just a second. By the way, for those of you at home and in the Soviet Union, we are now, thanks to a small army of interpreters, talking to both audiences. And Leonid and I have prepared, separately, I might add, a couple of reports to set the stage. In part, they suggest what we individually think our own societies believe and value about human rights. Then we go on to talk about the changes the Soviets say they have made and changes that most Americans believe should still be made. We begin with Leonid and the Soviet view.
Just a week ago, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of our new constitution. It guarantees to Soviet citizens a wide range of rights in all spheres of life. The Soviet concept of human rights incorporates social, political, civil, and personal rights. The guarantee of the exercise of those rights is constantly in the focus of attention of the USSR Supreme Soviet. We state with satisfaction that we have gained considerable achievements in this area. All Soviet people enjoy the right to work, to education, to health protection, to social security, to rest and leisure. They can elect and be elected to bodies of state administration at all levels, have the right to form and participate in social, professional, cooperative and other organizations. Soviet citizens are protected by the law. They can freely express their thoughts and criticize state and party bodies and officials of all ranks, using mass media and other democratic forms of procedure.
These people are demonstrating in front of the White House against American government policy in South Africa. They are exercising their right of free speech, one of the human rights Americans believe all people should enjoy. Americans believe it is a human right to be protected from arbitrary arrest and detention, a human right to travel when and where you want, a human right to read or write any book, a human right to pray or not to pray. Americans are taught to recognize injustice, that there is inequality in their homeland. They are also taught that as individuals they can do something about it. Human rights are central to the American experience. This, after all, is a nation of immigrants. The vast majority of us, or the people we're descended from, came to this nation in search of freedom and the human rights that go with it.
We do not consider all problems concerning human rights to be solved. Peculiarities of historical development and, in some cases, unjustified subjective decisions in the past led to eliminations or violations of certain civil rights. Cases of such violations occur to this day. Till recently, we had cases when the political, labor, housing and other rights of citizens were isolated. At present, the objective is that every procurator in the area entrusted to him would be empowered to enforce the observance of legality without succumbing to any local influence and would see to it that the rights of citizens are respected to the full. A dynamic process of democratization started 2 years ago. It leads in every possible way to the enforcement of law and development of people's initiative. Soviet newspapers and magazines reflect the process of restructuring. They print various, often contradicting points of view. Soviet people exercise the right to hold meetings and demonstrations even when they are at odds with generally accepted principles and values. Today we enjoy greater freedom of travel. Annually, millions of Soviet citizens go abroad on business, as tourists, and on private invitations. We have now simplified the procedure of acquiring entry and exit visas. Over the past 9 months, more than 16,000 people have received permission to leave the country for good. That is 3 times more than in 1986. Former Soviet citizens living abroad are now allowed to make visits to the USSR. We're simplifying the entry and exit procedure, eliminating formalities to enable Soviet citizens to expand contacts with their friends and relatives abroad. The Soviet constitution guarantees every citizen the freedom of worship, although the church is separated from the state and school from the church. In Soviet cities and villages, believers of all denominations worship freely in their churches, mosques, synagogues and places of worship. Such places of worship function and are being opened all over the Soviet Union. The process of democratization covers all levels of administration, from improving the election system to free elections of management at industrial facilities and offices.
Americans are obviously encouraged whenever they hear that Soviet citizens are better able to express themselves freely.
Well, as people who love freedom in every aspect, we care about the rights, the protection, the freedom, the human rights of everybody in every country.
Americans were overjoyed when Andrei Sakharov and Yelena Bonner were no longer seen only on KGB film in their internal exile in Gorky, but as free citizens again in Moscow. Millions of Americans were optimistic when Anatoly Sharansky was released from prison and permitted to emigrate. But Americans do not understand why your government will not let everyone leave who wants to go.
I want to Israel!
Like the grandparents of Leonid Friedman, they have been trying to get exit visas for 10 years.
The official reason for their rejections is that my grandfather is a security risk. Now, my grandfather is not a general. He's not a nuclear scientist. All his life, he was a manual laborer in a factory.
From an American's point of view, some of your government's practices have been unacceptable, such as characterizing political dissent as a mental disorder. Viktor Davidov was charged with slandering the Soviet state. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital.
After I left the Soviet Union in 1994, I was examined by 2 American psychiatrists and 1 British psychiatrist, and none of them could find a single symptom of my mental illness.
International human rights organizations presently identify more than 100 Soviet citizens in psychiatric hospitals for their political views. It is encouraging to see the Soviet press investigating these practices. Your reforms are very welcome in the West. Lev Timofeyev was sent to prison for publicizing the Soviet black market. He was recently pardoned, and he's back in Moscow. He says it is lovely to speak out, but he is still anxious.
Just now we have only one guarantee. That is good words of General Secretary. Who knows what words he will pronounce tomorrow.
And while Americans are encouraged by what they have seen in the last couple of years, Americans are also somewhat uncertain. Americans earnestly believe that wider publication for writers, greater freedom of expression for filmmakers and playwrights, in fact, greater freedom of expression in every sphere, would draw our 2 nations closer together and make the world a more stable place. One of your most distinguished scientists, now free of a Soviet prison and teaching in America, puts it very simply.
I
would like to tell the Soviet authorities, don't be afraid of more radical reforms. They won't destroy, but rather strengthen the system.
As sometimes happens on this program, our little bit has finished 18 seconds ahead of the Soviet little bit. But what you're seeing is really quite fascinating. Yuri Orlov and others talking to Soviet citizens in their own language where they may never have been heard on Soviet television before. And that in itself we regard as an important dimension of these programs. Let us now rejoin our Soviets. Leonid, we hear a lot, as I think you know, about glasnost these days, and one of the things we'd like to explore very much this evening is whether glasnost gives Soviet citizens the permission to speak out or the right to speak out. That's a very critical difference for Americans, as I'm sure you understand, and we will discuss that, I hope in earnest, when we come back. First of all, what we're going to do is to indulge in what our Soviet viewers have seen before as something of a capitalist tradition. We're going to let an American sponsor try to sell us something. We'll be back in just a moment.
This ABC News Special, Capital to Capital, is being brought to you by Citicorp.
The dream of success. You can see it in the eyes of people all across America. At Citicorp, we understand the dream and the hard work, the passion, the commitment that Americans pour into it. That's why we're committed to helping people turn their dreams into reality. Today, as Citicorp and Citibank, we're America's largest financial services organization, already helping 1 in every 5 families across the nation. With more home mortgages, more student loans, more MasterCard and Visa cards than any other company. If you have a dream of success, we can help it take shape. We'd like you to get to know us better. Citicorp, because Americans want to succeed, not just survive.
My father, Gordon McCrae, was one of the biggest stars in musicals. He was also an alcoholic. When I was little, I thought I could stop my dad from drinking. But only the alcoholic can do that. And finally, my father got help and stayed sober the last 7 years of his life. I was so proud of him. Alcoholism is treatable and preventable. Be alert to signs that you might need help, especially if you're the child of an alcoholic. For information, call the National Council on Alcoholism, 1-800-NCA-CALL.
Hi, I'm Anita Baker. Feeling the magic of love is great, but it's even better when you remember important things like being smart about sex and relationships. Love and sex don't have to go hand in hand, but if and when they do, Planned Parenthood has programs that help families talk about these things. You can get the answers you've been looking for. Believe me, knowing more doesn't take away any of the magic. For more information, call Planned Parenthood.
Tomorrow, the tale of terror continues as Charles Glass retraces his desperate escape through the streets of Beirut. Watch ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Live from the Kremlin in Moscow. And from Capitol Hill in Washington, this is Capital to Capital. Here again, Peter Jennings.
On the first program we did some weeks ago, we got to start. This time, Leonid Zolotarevsky in Moscow gets to start. Leonid?
Thank you, Peter. The program has begun. From what we saw and in the commercial, it would appear that we live very bad in the Soviet Union, but you live very well in the United States. But there's another thing I'd like to say. We have told how the situation is in our country, and you spoke about how the situation is in our country from your point of view. You didn't say anything about the situation with human rights in your country. This is not a condemnation of the beginning of your position. It's just an invitation to you, if you like. We shouldn't play into one goal. We're two teams, after all. Let's not hide anything from each other, so let's discuss the common problems, the common questions, which should yield the desirable results of this discussion. Mr. Zakladin, would you mind beginning?
I'd be glad to. First of all, I'd like to greet Senator Moynihan, with whom we met recently in Moscow, and Congressman Hoyer, with whom we also met recently in Moscow. Then we had a good discussion, and I think that now we'll have a good discussion too. Senator, first of all, I want to say that I saw this film, both of them, with great interest. I don't quite agree with Leonid Zolotarevsky because despite the fact that from these film clips, specifically from the commercial, we see that we have common problems, specifically alcoholism, which we'll talk about, I think. But I want to say, Senator, that unfortunately the film is a little bit outdated, perhaps fortunately, because there we had the Friedman couple who supposedly have not been let out, and it's true for a long time that they couldn't leave for a long time, but now they are permitted to leave, and therefore they can join their relatives in the United States. So in this part, your film clip is outdated.
Mr. Zakladin, can I interrupt you, please?
This is good, not bad.
Can I interrupt you? I apologize, but is that an announcement that the grandparents of Mr. Friedman are about to leave? Because if it is, I can assure you, it is the first that the family in the United States has ever heard about it.
Peter, you understood me completely correctly.
Well, I can assure you, sir, they're going to be very happy to hear that news this evening. Please continue.
Senator and Mr. Hoyer, I wanted to continue in the following vein. I think I have to say that I wanted to participate in this broadcast, knowing who would be present on the American side, and secondly, because of the importance of the subject. I think that the topic of human rights is a great topic of our day. We consider it to be very important, both in the international framework and with regard to our own country, because I think, and Congressman Hoyer spoke of this when he visited our country last time, that there is no ideal situation anywhere, neither in the United States, and we don't think that we have the ideal situation either. We have problems. We have different problems of different sizes, different nature, but we have common problems as well, and for this reason it's very interesting and important to discuss them. Our communist Soviet program task is to develop personality in all its aspects. But of course, at different stages of development of society, this task has been resolved differently and has been understood differently. And now we have perestroika, reconstruction. As I understood from what the words of Peter Jennings, this is of interest to you, and we'd be glad to share with you what is going on in our country, and we can answer your questions, and of course we'll ask you questions as well, because I repeat, we have common problems as well.
Well, Mr. Zagladin.
And we know what's going on in the United States. We want to ask about that. This is what I wanted to ask for the beginning.
Good. Well, that's very nice to hear from you. Perhaps Senator Moynihan would like to respond to you at the beginning, perhaps with a statement or perhaps with a question.
Well, certainly to agree and to say hello again, that Mr. Zagladin says there are no ideal situations in the world, in either of our countries. That's right. But there are situations that are better and there are situations that are worse. And what the world thinks, and what is true, is that the Soviet Union had been a hell for human rights for most of this century, and that you haven't yet even got back to the condition of the czars. Under the czars, commissars did not have to allow a person out of the country. You had free immigration under the czars. You get tickets by permission one at a time under the Soviets. Under the czars, the Ukrainian Catholic Church was a free church. Under the Soviet Union, it is a clandestine church. Under the Soviet Union, Pravda appeared on the streets of Moscow. Find an opposition paper in all the Soviet Union today.
Peter, do we get to join in now or later?
I apologize, Peter. There was a problem here with the translation. The translation wasn't coming through. So the first part of what was said by Senator Moynihan wasn't heard here.
Well,
so we apologize again for that misunderstanding. I wonder if the Senator might repeat briefly what he was saying.
I'm quite sure the Senator will repeat what he said.
I will say briefly, first of all, welcome, Mr. Zagladin. Spasiba. I say that I agree with him that there is no ideal situation about human rights in our country or in yours. But there are better and there are worse. And the fact is that for most of this century, the Soviet Union has been a hell.
Peter, I'm sorry for interrupting again.
Please, Leonid, explain.
There is no translation.
There is no translation. I'm afraid if there is no translation, Leonid, the difficulty is in Moscow, because Senator Moynihan will be interpreted, I should say, not translated by someone in Moscow.
Yes, of course, you're right.
Now,
the problem is on our side, of course. But we're trying to solve the problem.
While we are working that out, Leonid, and I apologize, Senator Moynihan,
sure.
Congressman Hoyer, and to our audiences in both the Soviet Union and the United States.
Everything's okay, Peter.
It is okay. Good, then Senator Moynihan will have another go at you.
Everything's okay now, I'm sorry.
See if I can get it right this time. Hello, Mr. Zagladin. Spasiba. I wanted to agree with you that there is no ideal situation with respect to human rights in your country, ours, or any. But there are better and there are worse. And the plain fact, and all of you know it, it's been part of your agony as a people, that through most of this century, the Soviet Union has been a hell for human rights. And it's not that you haven't even got back through the conditions of the Tsar. Under the Tsar, there was freedom of immigration. Anybody could leave. You didn't have to get a ticket from some commissar. Under the Tsar, the Ukrainian Catholic Church was a free church, not a clandestine church as it now is. Under the Tsar, Pravda appeared on the streets of Moscow every day, find an opposition in the whole of the opposition paper in the whole of the Soviet Union 70 years later.
Senator, I don't really welcome you with your comparison to Tsarist Russia. I think it's not realistic, and it's completely untrue. And of course, it's true that at the beginning, tens of thousands, even tens of thousands of homeless people, destitute people, yes, there were those people. In the 70 years that have passed since then, we don't have such types of people. We don't have homeless people, hungry people. Everyone in our country has the possibility to work and to get corresponding pay, the right to work, and so on. We spoke of all this. And for over 70 years, we've done so much that over one period, not a single country has done. And this is an historical fact, no argument. But I would say something else, that from your words, I see a confirmation of the obvious fact that in the discussions of human rights, we run into necessarily one big problem. The problem which I would call the difference of views, the difference of systems. And the concepts of human rights are different. And many of the things which we understand in one way, you understand in another. Many of the rights of man which exists in both countries, so to speak, are interpreted completely different. For example, let's take political rights. Elections. In your country, everyone can participate, and in our country, everyone can participate. But in your country, a person who wants to be elected or should be elected must spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on it to collect it or use his own personal money. This already puts people in an unequal situation. So we have the right, but it really doesn't exist for the majority. In our case, the deputies, when they are elected, the society takes upon itself all expenses, so their rights are the same, but it's interpreted differently. The same thing with the right to work. You recognize the right to choosing a profession. This is officially recognized in your country, but the right to choose a profession does not mean that the person can actually work in that profession. This does not mean that the society guarantees this. We have one and the other. So once again, you have the right, the same, but we understand it differently.
Mr. Zagladin, perhaps when we come back, we can try to find out, listening to Congressman Hoyer, who's done a lot of negotiating with the Soviet, whether or not there are some rights in the Soviet Union which Soviet citizens would not like to have in common with Americans. We'll be back right after this message.
I've really messed this one up. That new phone system I got us a while back. Now my boss wants to add computers onto it. Computers. The one I got can't cope with them. I'm really up the creek.
Every 3,000 miles, you can change your oil yourself, leave your car at the dealer, spend all day at the service station, or drive into Jiffy Lube with no appointment. In 10 minutes, the J-Team will change your oil with quality Pennzoil, replace the filter, lube the chassis, fill the important fluids, 14 quality services. Jiffy Lube turns an all-day oil change into a 10-minute family reunion.
Welcome to Jiffy Lube. We'll take care of you like family.
I cannot wait to get this ring on your finger. Anna, will you marry me?
Their romance took them through good times and bad. But their love brought the romance back.
Can you forgive me? I've been such a fool.
A love to last forever.
An enchanted evening.
Enchantment. It's a good word for it.
And now, at last, an event you can't miss. The wedding of Duke and Anna on General Hospital, Monday.
Thursday, he's a breed from down under.
I like your style.
He's Sledgehammer Dundee.
I think I'm just about to toss another whip on the baddie.
Then Cinderella makes an appearance.
Cindy, isn't there anything I can do for you?
That's life with the Charmings. Then Walter Matthau and Robin Williams.
That's supposed to shoot a person's gun?
Survivors right after Sledgehammer and the Charmings.
Friday, will the real dad please stand up?
Say Dad. Dad. Okay, now get off my back.
Full House. Then
I may be out of a job.
We'll still be fine. You've been making a nice salary for years. Judging from what you pay me, you must be sucking it away pretty good.
I married Dora. Then Max catches Game Show Mania.
Look at that hostess stroking the prizes.
Max Headroom.
And I'm sorry, we're out of time. Bye.
After Full House and I Married Dora, Friday.
On 2020 Friday, shot and blinded, kidnapped, raped, and left for dead. How this woman's inner strength is inspiring other victims of crime. 2020 Friday.
Should surrogate parenting be banned? Tomorrow we'll ask Mary Beth Whitehead.
And later this week, Betty Davis and Faye Dunaway.
That's this week on Good Morning America. Tonight's program represents something of a technical achievement. You are watching images being transmitted via 3 satellites above 2 oceans. A primary path carries signals between Washington and Moscow over Europe and the Atlantic. A secondary route carries additional pictures from Moscow to an Earth station 700 miles southwest of the Soviet capital. Then up to a satellite over the Indian Ocean, down to an Earth station in West Germany, back up to a second satellite over the Atlantic, and then down to the United States in West Virginia. Soviet television receives our pictures by the same route, but going the other way. Despite the fact that all of these signals are traveling through space at the speed of light, it still takes nearly 2 seconds for them to complete their journey. As has often been the case in the past, it appears, at least to us in America, that Soviet authorities, Mr. Zagladin, have once again timed an announcement to suit a political moment. But just to reaffirm, if I understand you correctly, that Mr. and Mrs. Natan Kach, who have been trying to emigrate from the Soviet Union for 17 years, are going to be able to come and join their grandchildren, among them Leonid Friedman, here in the States. And there were a couple of other developments in the Soviet Union today which we at least thought were newsworthy. I'd be curious to know if Soviet citizens knew about them as well. Vladimir Schlepak, who first applied to leave the Soviet Union 17 years ago, announced today that he has been told that he and his wife may finally emigrate. He was an early member of the Helsinki Watch Group, which monitors the Helsinki Accords, and he has spent part of the last 17 years in internal exile. And Vladimir Titov, a political prisoner for 18 years in labor camps, and he tells us psychiatric hospitals, tells us today that he's been given permission to emigrate. He was originally sentenced for reporting on the condition of other Soviet political prisoners. Congressman, is this par for the course?
Peter, I think it is par for the course, but I'd like to follow up with Mr. Zagladin because in the room here with Ambassador Dubinin and us are relatives of 3 people who would have loved to have been on that announcement, Mr. Zagladin, and the United States citizens would have felt much better about the Soviet Union and your discussions about human rights if Yuri Balavlenkov had been on that list, if Victor Fremark had been on that list, or Leon Charney had been on that list. And I frankly could go through a list of hundreds, which I have given to you and others in the Soviet Union when we've met. And I would suggest to you that really our understanding of human rights is really not so much different. In the Helsinki Final Act, we said that these rights emanated from the dignity of the human person. Soviet citizens, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, U.S. citizens, citizens of Great Britain, their dignity as persons are what their rights are based upon. And we in the United States believe that, as Trent Lott said in discussing arms control, and as Mr. Tolkanoff agreed, if there is to be better understanding between us, if there is to be better cooperation, we need to rely on the promise of Helsinki, which really said to us all that how we treat our own citizen is going to be a test of how well we can be trusted. And Mr. Gorbachev has talked about trust. He's talked about cooperation and partnership. I think the American public wants that. They want a more peaceful, more secure world, which was the objective of Helsinki. But we hope that you will let people go who simply ask for the right to come, to be with their wives, to be with their families, to be in a country of their choice, wherever that country is in the world. We believe that Helsinki promised that. And President Ford said, and I agree, and I hope that you agree, that the promise of Helsinki is fine, but the test of whether Helsinki is a success will be the performance of the Soviet Union, the United States, and others.
Congressman, as you address that question to Mr. Laptev, can we just add, why don't you, Mr. Laptev, just let people go who want to go?
Mr. Hoyer, and our distinguished moderator, it seems to me that our conversation is moving in a direction which is favorable either to one or to the other side. Couldn't we talk about more common things? Couldn't we stop making this or that claim against each other? And rather, the difference lies in the context in which we consider these rights and the way in which individual cases are resolved, and the relationship between each case and the law. I could mention a lot of different facts from both sides, and both of us have such facts to adduce. In response to your question, Peter, as to why we don't allow some people to go, each time each question is resolved on the basis of Soviet law, with a thorough study of all the circumstances. And a mere statement that such a person wants or does not want to leave, or has left or not left, it really doesn't get us anywhere. I think that our conversation here will be more productive if we see the interrelationship between the whole system of human rights. How the system of human rights relates to the capacities of the country, to its constitutional setup, its laws, its traditions, and its opinions, the opinions of the majority. I think this is the way we ought to move in our exchange.
Mr. Laptev.
And then we can see how the discussion will develop.
Mr. Laptev, I'm sorry to say that from an American point of view, I think you're kind of on the stick, as we say here. I think we all agree that it would be wonderful to find occasions this evening where the two countries have something in common. But I think Americans cry out to know what law it is you refer to, what aspect of the Soviet Constitution it is you refer to, which inhibits people from going where they want to. This is almost incomprehensible to Americans. Can you try to explain it to us?
Peter, I apologize for interrupting. Now, of course, Mr. Legadin will answer your question, but once again, I'd like to express my concern about the course of the discussion, concern which I expressed at the very beginning. The US Congress every year gets from the State Department a report on the observance of human rights in 150 or so countries, but not one about the United States performance. No. I don't know if our discussion would be very fruitful if we pursued that theme.
And again, I don't agree with Mr. Zolotarevsky, because this course of discussion doesn't bother me at all. I think it's interesting. I'd like to return to what Steny Hoyer talked about. First of all, I agree with him that we have the general thing is the General Declaration of Human Rights, the Helsinki Accord, and the general norms of morality are the same. So we do have common things. It's a good basis. Now, with regard to a specific question about getting out of the country, which you mentioned, you know that in the film clip which you show, there's an interesting phrase: the United States is a nation of immigrants. The Americans are nations of immigrants, and this is really so. And this explains to a great deal your attitude towards the problem of immigration as a whole. Our nation is not a nation of immigrants, and historically, in our country, we have a specific relation to the problem of immigration because we had two big waves of immigration after the revolution, after the Second World War. And both times we were talking on the one hand about people who were against the revolution, and secondly, those that were supporting the Hitlerites. So the relation of the people towards the immigrants were negative, but this is changing. And after the war, there's a question of reunification of families. There were people that got married, and of course, exit to socialist countries where we have a different situation, and the situation is changing. And I honestly want to say that as a deputy, I have met situations where the local authorities refuse exit visa to a certain person, although there are no reason for it. And they refuse because the local population is very hostile to this, very negative to it. And we're correcting these cases, but you must understand this, the psychological aspect of this.
Mr. Zagladin?
Now, within Perestroika, yes, I want to complete, or do you have a commercial?
No, no. No, no.
Go ahead, you have a commercial?
Absolutely not.
Then I'll continue.
Please.
Then I'll continue. Now, we have done a great deal in order to make more simple exits and entry. And we have constitutional rights, and we have corresponding legislation which provides for issues of exit and entry of our citizens. And barriers to exit, usually there's just one barrier, and this is the protection of state secrets, and this exists in all countries, including in the United States.
Peter, can I ask him a question on that?
And we have to say that in accordance with our rules and our principles are changing. And after the meeting in Bern in 1986, unfortunately the United States, although participated in the working out of the convention, did not want to sign it, but we took it as a rule for us and went even farther. And we have new regulations which significantly broaden, compared to how it was in the past, the possibilities of entry and exit. And first of all, we do this not only for close relatives.
I do not
want
to go to a commercial, but I know that we have a congressman here who's been trying to insert an observation about what you have been saying, and we want to mix it up with our audiences perhaps. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind, we'll ask Congressman Clay Shaw from Florida.
And I'm not quite finished.
Florida.
Perhaps you would tolerate Congressman Shaw from Florida inserting a comment there.
Yes, please, although I haven't finished.
Okay. Congressman?
I think at the beginning
I'm sure that the gentleman
allow Mr. Zagladin an opportunity to finish.
From the Soviet Union will have the opportunity to finish, and perhaps he, as part of his answer, or part of his conclusion to his statement, can answer the question specifically as to one divided spouse. One of my constituents, formerly a citizen of the Soviet Union, now a citizen of the United States, Galina Velashina, who is here with us this evening. She has been married to Pietris Pekinas. We have been trying for many, many years now to have him come out of the Soviet Union so they can be reunified with his wife. I've talked to the ambassador here in the United States from the Soviet Union, and we have finally, at least we've opened the door a little bit within the last few weeks in finding that Velina can go to the Soviet Union to visit her husband. But it is still incomprehensible to us here in the United States, knowing the value that we place in individual human rights, that Pietris would be precluded from immigrating to the United States. He's been refused now 17 times, and a satisfactory answer has not been given to him at all. So I would like if the gentleman, in completing his statement, would address that specific issue.
So you understand the insertion. Mr. Zagladin, please continue.
Okay. Yes, of course, I understand the essence, and I want to say immediately that I'm not familiar with this specific case. It's not in my area, so to speak. It's.
I'm sorry for butting in.
I'm from Lithuania. What's being discussed here are Lithuanians. This is a question of state secrets. That's what I heard said about the question regarding this case. And I think that both the wife is aware of this and the husband in this case.
Peter, let me ask.
This was some information from a deputy from Lithuania, Peters.
Let me ask Mr. Zagladin on that point.
Ask him. Mr. Zagladin hasn't finished what he wanted to say yet.
Mr. Zagladin, let me ask you if I can, sir. You have mentioned state security. The member of the Supreme Soviet who talked of state security. The individual who has been referenced has been denied 17 times, and on the basis of state security. Mr. Gorbachev said in 1985 in France that state security or security risk would occur for 5 years, and in very unusual cases, 10 years. All of the cases that have been mentioned here are either certainly more than 5 years, many are more than 10 years, and Mr. Gorbachev reiterated to Congressman Scheuer when I was visiting Moscow and we met with Mr. Gorbachev that 5 years would be the limit on security risk. Clearly, with the technology that we have today, it moves. Sometimes if you're away for a year, you're not current with secrets. We frankly in the United States believe that is an argument that doesn't hold weight. If Mr. Gorbachev is correct and 5 years is the limit, we'd be very pleased. Can you confirm or deny that, sir?
Peter, I'm sorry. Mr. Zagladin may not agree. Nevertheless, I will assume this risk. Doesn't it seem to you that if we're going to discuss any specific cases, whether they relate to our practices or yours, we won't be identifying the most important thing? Okay, we've been lucky. Both of us have been lucky. It happened that Deputy Peters here who knew something about this specific case. But there'll be some other cases we may not really know nothing about. At the very beginning, you told us, you told the Soviet viewers some news. Now, I'd like to give you some information which might be interesting to you, so that perhaps this will put an end to the problem of immigration, or talking about it. In the Soviet Union, there are just 549 applications for immigrating to other countries. That's all. So if you think that this is a big problem, let's discuss this problem as such. But individual cases won't get us very far.
First of all, not 549, a little more. There's only 549 Jews. There are probably about 800 altogether. But I want to say the following. Mr. Hoyer, he's both right and not right at the same time. He's not right in the sense that every country has its laws, which it abides by, and we can't change these laws as we wish or as any person wishes. And by the way, the citations from Comrade Gorbachev was not exact. He said 5, 10 years, and sometimes more. I was there myself, so I remember it well. There are different state secrets. It's different in your country as well, and different times for declassification of documents. And we have the following process now that we review some of our time frames, and he who has been refused in our country knows for how long. And the time frame can be limited. It can be shortened if, for example, the secretness of the facility can be reviewed. And since Congressman Hoyer spoke about lists which have been transmitted, I just want to tell our colleagues about the following. The lists which were transmitted to us last year, for the most part, these people, by the way, independently of the fact that they were lists, but simply because we have a process of perestroika, democratization, most of these people their problems have been solved. 51 cases in last year's list were for people who have not applied for exits, and so we have not examined their cases. 11 people refused to exit, although they could have. Permission was given. And this year, in April, there was another list transmitted, and I have the data here. 50 people got permission to exit in 8 cases for reasons of security. So far, they've been refused. But this is not forever, but only as far as the thing is secret. We have a list of separated families. And yes, I'm telling you about your questions. We have 12 cases. In 12 cases, exit has been permitted, and the others are being examined. And there was a list of sick people in need of medical treatment. 16 people have departed. 8 so far have not received permission, and 2 have not applied. So these are the data.
Mr. Zagladin, I just wanted to say very briefly that I think we here and you there find numbers somewhat diverting in the argument. The Helsinki Watch Committee, which monitors such matters in this country, says 10,000 people wish to leave and have applied. Whatever the case, perhaps we can move on to politics in just a moment when we come back.
Kellogg's Corn Flakes sets the standard for cereal.
There's something about the taste.
It's got kind of like a little nutty, crunchy taste to it. It's delicious.
The simplicity.
You open that box up, you put the milk in, slice up some bananas. Do you have any handy?
The crunch.
And it's like having a little party inside your own mouth.
That make Kellogg's Corn Flakes part of a breakfast people feel special about.
Kellogg's Corn Flakes really has it all. And I don't think that there's anything else that compares to it.
Corn Flakes from Kellogg's. What more could you want from a cereal?
We got an Amana washer and dryer. Honey, it's only laundry.
I know.
We don't mess around, do we? We went right for the top.
We did.
Amana. Didn't we say shop around, read up on it?
We did.
Yeah, compare prices, go for the best value.
We did.
And we got an Amana anyway.
We did.
Didn't we say don't go over our budget?
We didn't.
You see, that's real clean.
When you know exactly what you want, Amana.
Long ago on the frontier, homeowners insurance meant knowing the cavalry was close at hand. That kind of protection was hard to beat. It still is. Today, Kemper provides insurance to homeowners, condo owners, and renters with a wide range of money-saving discounts. And you can count on professional service from the independent agents who represent the Kemper cavalry. To protect your homestead, compare Kemper. You ride with us.
Is your baby smoking? Most people aren't aware of this, but if you or someone in your household is smoking, then your baby is smoking too. And babies who breathe tobacco smoke are twice as likely to have respiratory problems. So show your love by letting every breath your baby takes be as pure as the first. Please don't smoke. There's a baby in the house.
What do you have planned for today, honey?
I'm registering Bobby for kindergarten.
That reminds me, I better call Social Security about how to get a number for Bobby.
Well, why does Bobby need a Social Security number?
Starting this year, to claim a dependent on your income tax return, you have to get a Social Security number for anyone 5 years or older.
Really? Well, why don't you call Social Security now?
Good idea.
Maybe after this we can get Bobby a job. Just kidding.
A public service message from the IRS.
Live from the Kremlin in Moscow. And from Capitol Hill in Washington, this is Capital to Capital. Here again, Peter Jennings.
Welcome back. It seems to be the agreement of both panels that the broad point has been made about emigration from the Soviet Union, and there is something of a consensus that we should move on. Leonid?
Peter, okay. So we'll go on to the next question. But before the commercial, Congressman Hoyer talked about 10,000. Mr. Zagladin wants to comment on that. But I remember the figure of 10,000, which was mentioned by the former Deputy Permanent Representative in the United Nations, Mr. Young. He said there were 10,000 political detainees in the United States. This was Mr. Young who said this. So the figures coincide.
First, I'll return to your figure. In this year, over 9 months, exit visas have been given in accordance with our new regulations, of which I spoke, 19,300 73 people, about 4 times more than last year. And now in the organs of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, we have 7,499 people of various nationalities, and Leonid has already spoken about the Jewish nationalities, 7,499 people as of October 1. All of them are being examined, and obviously everyone who has the possibility to get this will receive the right to exit, but not everyone will use it, because in this year 274 people have not been able to exit, although they had the right to. Okay, let's get it over with immigration. And again, in the film clip which we saw, reminded me that there have been common problems, alcoholism, smoking, but there are also others, and I want to tell you the following, that our Parliament is interested in many problems of human rights and interested in different ways, for example, in the area of health. Right now, we are studying what people think and discussing about legislation about improving health. In the United States, as we know from congressional documents, the problem also exists because many people, because of the high costs, cannot have sufficient medical assistance. What does the Congress have in mind to do in this regard? We'd be interested in that.
Well, can we,
and we also have a chronic problem of drugs, which you have, and we also have it, and we've gotten it at the very beginning, gotten a hold of it, so to speak. What do you intend to do? What exchange of experience here?
Mr. Zagladin, and I'm glad you raised the question of our respective parliaments, as you say, our Congress, your Supreme Soviet. Your Supreme Soviet meets 4 days a year. We meet almost every week of the year. And here's you said earlier, and this is so important, you contrasted the condition of someone running for office in the United States, where you have to raise money and go out there to win elections, whereas you don't have to raise money in the Soviet Union. Well, the reason you don't is you don't have opponents in the Soviet Union. If we didn't have opponents, I don't think, I doubt very much Denny would raise much money. And it's what Mr. Laptiev said about human rights in the context of, your very fine interpreter said, the constitutional setup. The point is that the Soviet Union, the constitutional setup, is that of a single-party dictatorship. It was called the dictatorship of the proletariat, openly. Mr. Brezhnev changed that a bit, but still. Now, what we've been seeing, sir, and we like and respect you, and you know you're trying to talk to us, and we want you to know we want to talk to you. But, sir, you're sitting there as an official of a state telling us what will happen to individuals, what the state will permit. We're talking about a world in which individuals decide for themselves whether they will stay, whether they will go, what they will do. And I don't think you can ever break out of your single-party apparatus and allow oppositions. But let me ask you, do you think you can?
Before you ask him, in fairness, he also asked you what the Congress was going to do about the burden of health care on many Americans, including those who are chronically ill.
We're passing it right now, a catastrophic health insurance pact in the Senate. It's been passed in the House. We spend a very great deal of our monies on health, and it's getting better. May I make a point? I know some of the problems. You really weep for the Soviet people. In the 1970s, the life expectancy of males dropped in the Soviet Union. It's the first time in the history of demographic statistics this has happened. And so they had to stop publishing their census data. See, that's a state secret. I mean, that poor man who's been keeping state secret for 17 years, in a one-party state, a telephone book is a state secret. The state party lives on a monopoly of information. And I don't know, can you break out of that? I know you want to do it for your economy. You know you have to do it for your economy. Can you do it for your people as well? I mean, I'm asking.
Mr. Laptiev and Mr. Zagladin, both. Those are...
Mr. Monahan, all that we do for the economy, we're doing for the people. We don't have purely economic interests. These are all the interests of the people. And in that respect, this is perfectly normal and needs no proof. That's why we set our restructuring in motion. That's why we've been working so hard at it. As we've been trying to boost our economy so that our people can live better, so we can make their situation an easier one, improve their well-being and resolve the problems that we really have, including questions of public health, which we mentioned. And it is no secret as to the life expectancy of our population. Your information is a bit out of date, I'm afraid.
You're right, I know that.
In fact, we've been publishing data showing how there is now occurring a rise in the longevity of our population.
I grant that is true. In the 1980s, you recommenced the census data. You're absolutely right, sir.
But that's a significant change.
No, there's been a great number of changes. The fact is that not everything can change all of a sudden. I agree with you. There's quite a few problems, some of them due to our lack of decisiveness or perhaps incompetence or whatever. But there's a vast amount of work being done right now. And as a result of our fight against drunkenness and alcoholism, the state of the health of the people has significantly improved. And as a result of the measures which have already been carried out to improve health, I think that by the time we next meet, the results will be even more striking.
Well, good, and we look forward to that, and we'd like to join with you if you could give us some sense that you're breaking out of that iron dictatorship from the Kremlin. That's what's holding you back. Everybody knows it. You know it. And if you could just give a little indication of it, the world is going to want to help you. We don't want to see your life expectancy